Evening, everyone. Tonight we have Rick, who is a railroad historian and author with an expressed interest in New England railroading in the second half of the 20th century. He has authored four books on the subject: The New England Southern Railroad, Volumes 1 and 2, Queen City Rails, Manchester Railroad, 1965 to 1990, and Steam Trains of Yesteryear, the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern Story, which we're going to hear about tonight. A 2018 graduate of Keene State College history program, Rick currently serves as the president and newsletter editor for the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society and is employed college admissions for Southern New Hampshire University. With that being said, Rick, it's all up to you, buddy.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And thank you again to the organization for the opportunity to present before you tonight. A little bit of backstory about this particular topic and subject. So about 5 years ago now, hard to believe, I started researching the story of Steamtown's early years in New England, particularly what happened and why things went the way they did in New England. Growing up in New England and New Hampshire, and being interested in trains, I was kind of always familiar with the story of Steamtown and various bits and pieces of the story. I knew that things had happened in Keene. I knew that something had happened at Lake Sunapee. I knew that Steamtown was in Vermont for a few decades and then moved to Pennsylvania, where it is today. I had heard the name Nelson Blount. I had heard various bits and pieces sprinkled throughout VHS tapes and books and things like that. But I think a lot of people, myself included, didn't know the full story, and it turned out to be quite a story. And that led to the book Steam Trains of Yesteryear, which came out 2 or 3 years ago now. But this particular presentation today, we're going to be talking about one of the more fascinating chapters of that story. And there's a lot of what could have been, there's a lot of possibly what should have been. And I hope you'll find some of the information new and exciting. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And we'll go right into the presentation. So I put this presentation together actually for the city of Keene, for the Historical Society of Cheshire County in Keene, New Hampshire. Back in 2022, they were celebrating, well, some of us were celebrating and kind of pushing it on them to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Steamtown's brief period where they were in the city of Keene, New Hampshire. And technically not Steamtown itself. We'll get into the sort of specifics of what actually happened in 1962. But in order to talk about this topic here today, we do have to discuss the root of all of it, which was Nelson Blount, a name that many of us are familiar with, many of us have heard of before, but none of what you're going to hear today happens without Nelson Blount. And a lot of history that happened after that was because of him almost solely, which is very fascinating that he's such a central figure to this story. That if you remove him from any piece of it, at least up until 1967, whole thing falls apart and turns into fiction. So who exactly was Nelson Blount? Well, he was kind of a larger than life character. He was born in Warren, Rhode Island, near Providence in 1918, and he was born into a family that was involved in the ice business. So back before electrical refrigeration was widespread, for a lot of people, ice and the delivery of ice is the way that food and perishable goods were preserved. And this happened into the 20th century as well. Electrical refrigeration did obviously exist before the turn of the century, but it wasn't as widespread as we think it was. So Blount's family was involved in the ice business. Nelson was raised up in this sort of middle to upper middle class family in the ice business. And his house in Warren, Rhode Island, was right down the street from the New Haven Railroad, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, New Haven for short, which is one of the larger railroads in New England history, operating in the southern New England portion of the region. And as a child, Nelson would walk down to the railroad yard and visit the switch crews. He would learn sort of the tools of the trade. He would get cab rides in the steam locomotives, and he became very acquainted with the railroad life at a young age. And that sort of created this passion for trains and railroading. I think a lot of us have, when we think about what got us into this topic, into this interest, we have memories of watching trains or being brought trackside by our parents, or perhaps meeting an engineer and having a cab ride in a locomotive. And he was no different than many of us in what caused him to absorb this passion. Nelson was lucky enough to meet kindred spirit at a young age. He actually went to school with a gentleman by the name of Fred Richardson. And in 1933, I believe it was, Nelson and Fred both played hooky from school, go to Providence to see the Royal Scot, which was a British steam train that had come to the US to tour the US before going to the World's Fair in Chicago. And so they happened to see each other in Providence that day, and they recognized each other from school. And that triggered a lifetime friendship and partnership in the railroad interest. That picture there is Nelson on the right and Fred to the left. They co-authored a book called Along the Iron Trail when they were still in school. And this was one of the very first books written by and for railroad enthusiasts. So they kind of pioneered that as well. In their teenage years, they would take motorcycles and an old roadster car and go up to Maine. And the state of Maine is where the very last 2-foot narrow gauge steam locomotives were still operating in regular service in the United States, at least in the New England region. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the Bridgeton and Saco River Railroad, which was one of those 2-foot narrow gauge railroads. 2-foot, of course, meaning that the rails are 2 feet apart, as opposed to standard railroads, which are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. So that means that the locomotives and rolling stock are quite a bit smaller than you would see on a standard railroad. It was kind of a more economic way of building railroads in more remote places. But they would go up and they would frequent these narrow gauge railroads because the narrow gauge trains were being taken out of service and the railroads were being shut down. And so they wanted to go absorb as much as they could before it disappeared forever. And those experiences that they had up in Maine at these 2-foot narrow gauge railroads, witnessing things disappear before their eyes, started to instill a mission in them to preserve as much of this as they could. And that's where the gears really start turning for Nelson and Fred up in Maine in the 1930s, when they start to see steam engines start to disappear, and steam railroading as it was in the 1800s and the early 1900s begin to disappear. And throughout the rest of the 1930s, the major standard gauge railroads in the United States begin to replace some of their steam locomotives with new diesel technology. And so there becomes sort of a fear and worry around the country that this steam railroading way of life is starting to vanish before people's eyes. Nelson could not go to war during World War II. He had been sick as a child, and he had also hurt his back in a diving accident, so he was held back from military service. Fred went off to the Coast Guard. But Nelson dove into the family business, and particularly his uncle's seafood business. And during the war, Nelson furnished a number of seafood contracts with the US military in Cape Cod and other places around New England. And by the end of World War II, he was a millionaire and had made that money doing that business. And so he was doing very well for himself by the end of the Second World War. Some of that money that he made in his business, he poured into his hobbies. He was very interested in flying. He was, of course, very interested in trains. He was also very interested in antiques, antique flintlock muskets and firearms, antique collections, Americana, things like that. And he collected all these things with some of that money that he made in his business life. As the 1950s come around, Nelson starts to branch out a little bit. He moves his family from Rhode Island up to New Hampshire, to Dublin, New Hampshire, right in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. And he opens a place called Staghead Farm, which is a family-run farm. And he employs some farmers there, and he lives full-time with his family there. He often drives or flies his private propeller planes to get to business locations and things like that. So they're living in New Hampshire by the 1950s. Nelson gets a chance to sort of exercise his interest in the railroad field by getting into actual railroading itself. So initially, he was into model trains and things like that. In the 1950s, Nelson is able to buy the Edaville Railroad in South Carver, Massachusetts. This picture here is not the Edaville Railroad, but Nelson is able to buy the Edaville in South Carver, Massachusetts, which originally had been a cranberry plantation. And the owner of that plantation, Ellis Atwood, bought a lot of the narrow gauge trains up in Maine when those railroads were shutting down, had them moved down to his cranberry plantation, and set up a working railroad to help bring cranberries in and out of the bogs. And very soon, tourists started to take notice of this and pay attention to it. And Ellis Atwood realized that he could make money carrying people around in tourist trains, in these little 2-foot narrow gauge trains. Ellis was killed in a screening house explosion in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And so Nelson Blount gets the chance to buy Edaville, and he does. And he buys the whole property and turns it into a tourist attraction, essentially. So by 1955, Nelson Blount owns Edaville. He's running the narrow gauge trains. He's being an engineer. He's getting a chance to do the things that he always wanted to as a kid. And then he starts to get the bug of full-sized, standard gauged steam locomotives. The very first steam locomotive that Nelson is able to purchase is the Boston and Maine's 1455. You can see it up in the top left next to a narrow gauge steam locomotive. The 1455 was one of the very last steam locomotives that the Boston and Maine used in active service, retired in 1956. And they sold it to Nelson, who bought it and put it on display at Edaville. So Nelson goes around the United States and Canada buying up steam locomotives from scrap lines as the railroads in the US and Canada start scrapping their steam locomotives. Most American and Canadian railroads had completely retired steam locomotives by 1960. So from 1955 to 1960, there are a ton of steam locomotives that are getting cut up for scrap. And using the money that he made in business, Nelson's trying to buy as many of them as he can to preserve them. And by 1960, he's got a collection of about 40 steam locomotives. He also has a collection of passenger cars and freight cars. He has steam-powered tractors and steam-powered fire engines and construction equipment. He wasn't just interested in steam trains. He was interested in steam power as well. And so he buys all these things and buys all this equipment, but doesn't really have a place to put any of it. And his first idea is to take some of the equipment and bring it to Edaville and put it on display at his park in Edaville. Unfortunately, Edaville was about 5 miles from the nearest railhead, and so any equipment that he brought into Edaville would have to be tractor-trailered into the park itself. So it wasn't a great place to display his growing collection. He then gets in contact with the people who own the Pleasure Island amusement park in Wakefield, Massachusetts, which was sort of marketed as the Disneyland of the East. It was kind of an attempt to make a theme park in New England. And Pleasure Island gave Nelson permission to display a decent amount of his collection at an exhibit called Engine City. And so that's what you see here in Wakefield, Massachusetts. That only lasted for about a year, from 1959 to 1960, because Nelson realized that he really wanted his own space where he could actually run the trains themselves. This was just static display. None of the full-size locomotives at Pleasure Island ran. They were all on display only, and there was some vandalism and stuff that happened there. So pretty quickly he decides, I'm going to get out of here and try to find my own place. And he finds the answer in North Walpole, New Hampshire, which you can see right here. North Walpole is on the western border of New Hampshire, right across the Connecticut River from Bellows Falls, Vermont. And in North Walpole is a full-size engine facility with a roundhouse, a turntable, a coaling tower, sand tower, and plenty of yard tracks to store his equipment. And the Boston and Maine agrees to sell the North Walpole facility to Nelson Blount, which he buys in 1960. Nelson announces in 1960 that he's going to open something called Steamtown USA, a cavalcade of steam power. And he envisions this to be the grandest and greatest railroad museum that has ever been built anywhere. And he certainly has a collection to do this. By 1960, Nelson Blount has the largest railroad collection owned by a private individual that up to that point had ever been assembled before. His plan was to build Steamtown at his new facility in North Walpole and run trains on the Boston and Maine's Cheshire branch towards Keene, New Hampshire. Unfortunately, the Boston and Maine, even though they were willing to do that, did not have a labor agreement that would have allowed Nelson's employees to run their own trains on Boston and Maine tracks. It would have to be operated by Boston and Maine employees. And 1960, there are no more steam locomotives on the Boston and Maine, so none of the employees are currently up to training with steam locomotives. And so Nelson's in a stuck place. He has North Walpole. He could open his park, his museum at North Walpole, but he can't run trains anywhere. And the summer of 1961 is fast approaching. So, in a desperate fit, Nelson goes to Samuel Pinsley, who owns the short line independent railroad Claremont and Concord up in a little further in the Sunapee region of New Hampshire. And he asks Sam Pinsley, can I run chorus trains on your line for this summer so I can build public support and public interest for Steamtown? And then next year, we can open Steamtown where I wanted to open it. But this year, it's too late to do that. Can we run on your tracks for the summer? And Pinsley said yes. So in the summer of 1961, Nelson Blount establishes the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern Railroad. And this is going to be the tourist railroad component of the Steamtown, USA Museum. And he takes equipment from his private collection and brings it up to Lake Sunapee and runs along the Claremont and Concord for the summer, using some yellow wood coaches that had been bought from the Boston and Maine and a 464T tank locomotive, number 47, that he got from Canada, from the Canadian National. Unfortunately, this particular operation only lasted for about 6 weeks. And the reason for that is in August of 1961, a locomotive inspector visits the railroad and realizes that the paperwork, the inspection paperwork for number 47 is missing a couple of items on the paperwork. It's missing the dates that certain maintenance was last performed on the locomotive. Now, the reason that the inspection sheet for number 47 doesn't have those dates listed is because when Nelson bought the locomotive from the Canadian National a few years before that, the Canadian National told Nelson, we don't have the paperwork for this engine anymore. We got rid of it. We disposed of the paperwork. So because of that, Nelson and the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern don't know the last time that some of these items were maintained by the Canadian National. However, they do their own tests on the locomotive. They have experts come and look at the locomotive and vouch for those particular items. So there's nothing mechanically wrong with the engine at all, but clerically, they don't have the history of maintenance from the Canadian National. And because of that, the inspector takes the locomotive out of service after about 6.5 weeks. Kind of an interesting aside, it's worth mentioning here, I think. Nelson actually reaches out to the Canadian National and says, are you sure you don't have the paperwork? And the Canadian National says, yes, we don't, but we can ask the Board of Transit Commissioners in Canada. They may have a copy. And the Board of Transit Commissioners do have a copy of the paperwork. And so they send the paperwork to Nelson Blount. Unfortunately, the paperwork that they send to Nelson Blount does say that the locomotive was due for an overhaul in a very short period of time, and it was going to be a very expensive overhaul. And so instead of doing all that work on the 47, Nelson just takes it out of service and removes number 47 from service, ending the 1961 season early. In the decades since this happened, it's become a common story that paperwork was somehow mysteriously lost in a roundhouse fire, and that's the reason why number 47 was taken out of service. That's not true at all. So if you ever hear that mentioned, that is not true. There was no fire. The paperwork was not lost in a fire. The paperwork just wasn't in hand by the Canadian National. They gave the paperwork away. And there were copies of the paperwork available. So it's not like the paperwork just magically vanished in a fire. And the reason we know that the paperwork magically didn't vanish in a fire is because when I was writing Steam Trains of Yesteryear, a friend of mine had a stack of paperwork that he had been given by Russ Monroe. Russ Monroe is a very well-known railroad enthusiast, and he also worked for the Boston and Maine. And on top of the stack of paperwork was a sealed envelope. And when I was talking to Brad, who had this paperwork, his girlfriend at the time asked him what was in the envelope. He said, "I don't know." So he opened it up, and inside was the original Canadian National Inspection Report for number 47. So what happened was right before Nelson Blount bought number 47 from the Canadian National, Russ Monroe went up to Canada on a railfan trip, and employees of the Canadian National gave Russ Monroe a bunch of old steam locomotive paperwork because they didn't think these engines were ever going to run again. And lo and behold, Nelson Blount buys the 47, puts it back into service, and Russ had the paperwork that was supposed to go with the engine. So it's kind of a stranger than fiction story, but that's the true story of why the 61 season ended early. 1962 rolls around. Nelson can no longer operate on the Claremont and Concord Railroad, and the Boston and Maine Railroad is still dragging their feet about operating on the Cheshire branch, which was Nelson's original plan. However, in early 1962, Nelson starts to explore the idea of opening Steamtown USA park component in Keene itself, rather than at his engine facility in North Walpole. The engine facility at North Walpole, even though it has the facilities that he needs for steam operation, it's very geographically limited with the Connecticut River on one side and a mountain on the other side. So there's not a whole lot of room for parking to support the amount of visitors that he's anticipating. And so he announces plans to build a site in Keene, New Hampshire, about 2 miles west of downtown Keene. The city of Keene is very open to this idea. They love the idea of Steamtown being in Keene. Keene doesn't really have a whole lot of tourist attractions even today. And so back then, the city was hot on the topic, and the mayor, Robert Mallet, who was one of the youngest mayors around, I think he was in his 30s at the time, was all over the project. So Nelson starts drawing up plans to build a facility in Keene with the pricing of how much it's going to cost, the structures that they're going to need to do it with, and they have engineers come up and draw plans and schematics and drawings. The city of Keene is willing to foot the bill for part of the construction cost. And then Nelson decides that he would like to get the state of New Hampshire involved, because even though he's a millionaire and he has lots of money, this is going to cost a lot more than he can afford, especially after preserving all of that railroad equipment and saving it from scrapping. So he goes to the state and he says, "If I work with you on building a park in New Hampshire, and I give you my entire railroad collection, would you be interested in funding the park?" The city of Keene is on board. The region is on board. And the new state of New Hampshire says yes, initially. Nelson also decides that the tourist trains, the excursion trains themselves, will be operated by the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern, his tourist railroad, and that will be separately owned. So even though the park will be owned by the state of New Hampshire and his collection will become owned by the state of New Hampshire, the train rides themselves will be privately owned and operated by Blount. June 28th, 1962 is a big day for the Steamtown plan. After about 4 hours of deliberating, the state votes to support the project in principle. The state of New Hampshire at the time has a $9 million recreation budget that they're just sitting on. And the state parks director, Russell Toby, recommends that $1 million out of that $9 million go to funding the project. And that would completely fund the building and operation of the Steamtown site. And they believed it would be self-liquidating because people coming to visit and spending money to gain entrance to the park and everything would liquidate cost of building the park. Local newspapers herald the plan as a great thing for Keene, a great thing for New Hampshire. And on June 29th, the Boston and Maine Railroad finally finalizes their agreement, which will allow the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern to operate excursions over their Cheshire branch from July 1st through September 14th, weekly, and then weekends until November 4th. And the governor at the time was Wesley Powell, and he was a huge supporter of the plan in 1962. Again, the city of Keene backs the project. They put money into sewage and water lines to the site. The state commits $1 million of that $9 million budget. And Mayor Mallet rallies the cause around the city, and the city votes 14-1 to commit $100,000 in 1962 dollars towards the construction of Steamtown, USA in Keene, New Hampshire. One of the big problems with the Steamtown project in Keene are the railroad tracks themselves, the Cheshire Branch. The Boston and Maine still owns the Cheshire Branch and operates freight trains over it. One of the things that they operate are milk trains, which run from Vermont to Boston with milk for grocery stores and distribution and stuff like that. This is a picture of a milk train coming back from Boston, heading up to Vermont, passing by the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern ticket booth in downtown Keene. But the Boston and Maine decides they'll run their milk train at night, and Nelson Blount can run his steam-powered tourist trains during the day. So they decide to work out a compromise. With basically all the green lights, Nelson takes a steam locomotive from his private collection, a 280 wheel type consolidation locomotive number 15, which had been built for the Tennessee and Oneida Railroad and later worked for the Rahway Valley Railroad of New Jersey. This was a very good steam locomotive, very powerful, very capable of operating in mountainous territory. And he had it restored in the spring of 1962 to operation. You can see number 15 on the turntable at North Walpole, which is at the very end of the Cheshire Branch where it arrives into Vermont. Interestingly enough, so the name of his tourist railroad is the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern. But while Nelson is on vacation one weekend, one of his employees, Donald Robinson, who was also a Boston and Maine employee, painted the name Monadnock Northern on the side of the engine because he thought it sounded better and fit on the engine better. And yeah, I think it sounds good too. And interestingly enough, he used a white on red font, which had previously been seen on very late Boston and Maine steam locomotives called speed lettering. So he kind of tried to replicate that on the Monadnock Northern's number 15. So it's finally time to bring number 15 to Keene and all the equipment as well that they're going to bring with them. And so on July 12th, 1962, number 15 is poled at the North Walpole facility by hand with shovels. They shovel coal from a coal hopper into the tender of number 15. And I believe Nelson is up there as well, helping out. Number 15 had been painted, polished, looked brand new. And so number 15, along with a diner car, the Mountaineer, and 5 wooden coaches, a wooden boxcar for storage, and 2 wooden cabooses, which would be used as employee housing, departed the yard at North Walpole and headed up the Cheshire Branch for Keene, New Hampshire. And there's various accounts of this happening, but all along the way, people came running out of their houses, pulled over at railroad crossings. Kids on their bikes started following the train. This is the very first steam locomotive to have passed over the Cheshire Branch in probably close to 8 years at this point, maybe 1952, 1953, possibly even earlier than that. The last time steam trains would have been used by the Boston and Maine on this line. So this was a very exciting sight for a lot of people. And of course, Nelson was the engineer on the equipment move from North Walpole to Keene. This is at Westmoreland, New Hampshire. Downtown Keene along Gilboa Avenue is where the Monadnock Northern sets up their headquarters for the 1962 season. They don't have a lot of time to do this, so they build a small little ticket booth. You can see a fire hydrant there. They use a fire hydrant and a fire hose to put water in the locomotive. There are no bathrooms, so the city of Keene advertises that people can walk around the block and go to the city hall to use the bathroom. So there wasn't a whole lot in the way of amenities for people coming to ride the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern in the summer of 1962. But they did with what they could, with the thinking that very soon ground was going to be broken on Steamtown, USA, the park, and they would have as much room as they needed. In the background to the left, you can see some brick buildings. That's a remnant of the old Cheshire Railroad shops in Keene. At the time, 1962, there was still a full roundhouse and a turntable left from the earlier era when those shop buildings were used to repair and house locomotives. Unfortunately, those buildings were occupied by the Central Screw Company. And so those buildings, even though they would have been perfect for a railroad museum, were never seriously considered to house the Steamtown Museum in Keene. They always intended on building a new facility 2 miles west of downtown. Facilities in downtown Keene included those 2 wooden cabooses that I had mentioned, which were used to house employees at night. And the locomotive was coaled at the Chabot Coal and Oil Silo in downtown Keene, which is still standing today. Opening day was July 13th, 1962, one day after the equipment moved to Keene. This is a fantastic photo that I found in an antique store, if you can believe it or not, of opening day in 1962. You can see Nelson Blount in his engineer's cap, shaking hands with Mayor Bobby Mallet, who, like I said, was only 30 at the time. And there's a couple other important people here as well. To the left of Bobby Mallet is the Governor's Council, Harold Weeks, who was a huge proponent of the Steamtown plan. He was from Hinsdale, New Hampshire. Roger Zerba, I believe, was a member of the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Commission in Keene. And then the rather grouchy looking fellow on the ground next to Roger Zerba is Clyde Sessions. Clyde was Nelson's master mechanic and sort of expert steam mechanic. But everybody was very optimistic about this. And there's kind of an interesting newspaper article that was written about Nelson. And you can see him talking to some CBS News reporters there in Keene. They said he was giddy as a kid and, smiling the whole day, super excited, super happy. And he wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought this was really the start of something big for the city of Keene and the state of New Hampshire. And unfortunately, as we'll see in the rest of the presentation, it wasn't quite to be. But there was a lot of optimism that these steam excursions in 1962 to build hype and excitement for the museum, which was hopefully going to break ground soon, was the start of something new for this part of New Hampshire that really has never had much in the way of tourist development. When you think about southwestern New Hampshire, really, hikers going to Mount Monadnock is pretty much the only thing that happens down there. In sort of a fit of coincidence, there were some actors for Keene's Summer Theater that were putting on the streets of New York. And so they were wearing, coincidentally enough, 19th century, 1800s period costumes. And so they climbed on the train for some interesting photo opportunities as the steam engine and bright yellow coaches headed out of Keene for the very first run. And Nelson was quoted as saying, "I don't think the steam locomotive can be beat in nostalgia in any way," which seems to be a common thought at the time, especially in the early era of steam preservation. The excursion trains ran to Mount Gilboa, which is in the town of Westmoreland, and that's where they ran around the train. So there was a passing siding there. They would uncouple the train from the north end, run it around on the parallel track, and hook it up to the south end so they could go back to Keene. And this is happening, as you can see. The gentleman walking down the tracks to the left is Fred Richardson, Nelson's friend. And the gentleman climbing out of the cab is Don Robinson, the person who painted the words Monadnock Northern on the tender of number 15. This is a cool shot because this is about 2 miles west of downtown Keene. This is the exact spot that the museum was supposed to be built at milepost 94 from Boston on the Cheshire Branch. And this shot was taken by Nelson out of the cab of the steam locomotive. This comes from the Blount family. They were very cooperative when I was writing the book. They sent me the entire family photo collection. And a lot of the photos were taken by Nelson himself, including this one, showing the crowd on opening day. As I had said, Mount Gilboa was the point where the train stopped and turned around. They built a little picnic grove there. There was a siding off of the main line where they spotted a wooden passenger coach and used it as a little souvenir shop for people. And there's a copy of a ticket to the left that was used in the 1962 season. Number 15, as I had mentioned, was nicknamed Faithful 15, built 1916, sold by the Rahway Valley in 1937, and purchased by Nelson from the Rahway Valley in 1955 and added to his collection. Number 84 was the Mountaineer. This was a diner lounge car, which had originally been used by the Boston and Maine and had carried Franklin Delano Roosevelt a few times. This particular car was the very first diner that Steamtown or any of Nelson's operations ever used. And in 1962, it was the only diner lounge car in service on any tourist railroad in the United States. And there's a sort of example of the menu that people could enjoy while they were on the train, air conditioned out of Keene in the summer of '62. Food was supplied by the Crystal Diner in downtown Keene, which is now the Margaritas restaurant, I believe. Nelson also brought down a number of wooden passenger coaches. He bought these passenger coaches from the Boston and Maine at bargain basement prices. These are really, really old passenger coaches. They were built in the early 1900s. And by the 1950s, they were being used by the Boston and Maine in work train service. So the B&M took all the seats out of them and were using them to haul around work equipment, basically. And so Nelson bought them at bargain basement prices from the B&M, painted them bright wood, bright yellow rather, and there were no seats in the coaches, as I had mentioned. So he was able to get his hands on some church pews in Peterborough, New Hampshire. And so you can see some of the ramshackle seating that they had in these coaches. Also, it's kind of a funny anecdote that a lot of these coaches didn't have glass in the windows either, because Boston and Maine had no need for glass in the windows because they were no longer being used to pull passengers. So state of New Hampshire said to Nelson, you have to have something to block the windows so people don't fall out of the train. So they ran a wall conduit tube, like the metal tube that you run along a wall to put wires through. They ran that down the middle of the windows, and that was good enough to keep people from falling out of the train as it was moving. So, it's kind of funny because as I was writing the book, I kept coming across these stories of Nelson and the Monadnock Northern kind of running by the seat of their pants as this motley crew, just doing whatever they can to make things work. And even though they had a strong leader with a lot of money in Nelson Blount, it really was a Yankee operation through and through. Very fascinating. So the schedule for the Monadnock Steamtown and Northern in 1962 was July 13th to September 9th, weekdays 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. departures from Keene, two departures every weekday. And then weekends, 3 departures, 11 a.m., 2 p.m., and 4 p.m. Then they went to a fall schedule from September 9th to November 4th. They only ran on weekends, those same 3 round trips with occasional extra special foliage excursions. Here's a shot of the train arriving at Mount Gilboa. I love this picture. It's very emblematic of classic 1960s tourist railroads. You have, this brightly painted train with sort of a nostalgic feel, operating over overgrown, decrepit tracks that were owned by the Boston and Maine. A lot of tourist railroads that get started in this time period are operating on tracks owned by larger railroads. And a lot of those larger railroads are hurting financially because of state highways and airlines and things like that. And they're more than willing to make money by allowing these startup tourist railroads to operate on their trackage. And so it's kind of funny to see, this brightly painted, showy tourist train operating on very overgrown railroad tracks. There was also a good amount of night photography. The 1962 season was well frequented by photographers and filmers, people that would show up and take pictures, rail fans, railroad enthusiasts, nostalgia enthusiasts. They took a host of photographs, and so there are a ton of pictures of the '62 season. including some really, really nice night shots. West Keene, New Hampshire. The Cheshire Branch, which was built in the 1840s, has a lot of stone arch bridges on it. And this is the stone arch bridge in West Keene. And it was a really nice place to get a photograph. And the train at this point would be climbing uphill out of Keene. Keene is situated in a prehistoric lake bed. So every direction out of Keene, you're going upwards, except south. So the train was heading west here, so it was climbing up a pretty steep grade. And this is a fantastic silhouette shot of the train heading through West Keene, through the fill in West Keene. Just such a neat picture of something that could have lasted a heck of a lot longer if things had changed. And I think this picture takes the cake. That's Mount Monadnock in the background, which is the second most climbed mountain in the world behind Mount Fuji in Japan. If you can believe that, more people climb Mount Monadnock than nearly every other mountain in the world every year. And so that's Monadnock in the background. Of course, Mount Monadnock is the mountain that the railroad was named after, the Monadnock Steam Town and Northern, and it was painted in the logo. So this is such an emblematic shot of this steam tourist railroad. And here's the train coming back, heading back towards Keene. The engine ran towards Westmoreland, the correct end front first, and coming back to Keene, tender first. There was nowhere to turn the locomotive. Even though you could run the engine around the train, you couldn't physically turn the locomotive around. There was no turntable or Y at Mount Gilboa. So they did have to run tender first going back to Keene, which is a pretty common steam practice, so it wasn't anything difficult. And this is the rock cut, the Summit Rock Cut, just outside Keene, just west of Keene. This is Route 12 that goes over the rock cut. And this is a deep, deep rock cut. This is a pre-dynamite rock cut, black powder and hand tools, done in the 1840s. And yeah, even driving through here today, the rails have been gone for decades, since 1972. But seeing this today, it is very impressive. And apparently you could stand on the road bridge where Route 12 crossed over the tracks, and you could hear the train coming for miles from downtown Keene because of that grade. And it was really working hard when it got to this point. This is a cool shot. This is the fall of 1962, the foliage season. They're using just about every coach they have for the fall foliage trips, for the leaf peepers. And that's also something that was unique because the 1961 season ended in August, ended prematurely. So there was no leaf peeping. 1962, the Monadnock Steam Town and Northern, they really get to enjoy the tourist dollar from the fall foliage season. Throughout the summer of 1962, as these tourist trains are flying out of Keene and people are coming and paying to ride them, there's an overhanging question of what's going to happen to the Steamtown USA Museum, because the tourist trains are doing really well, but nothing's really happening with the museum project. And the state of New Hampshire begins to drag its feet on committing to the funding. And the Boston and Maine Railroad is the real problem, because the state and Nelson Blount realize that if this museum is going to be a long-term project that's going to last, they have to own the Cheshire Branch. The state of New Hampshire and Nelson Blount did not want to rely on the Boston and Maine to maintain the Cheshire Branch, and they were also worried that the Boston and Maine might decide to abandon the line and leave them high and dry. And so both Nelson and the state decided they had to own the tracks that they were operating on, which, to be fair, is always a really good idea if you're a tourist railroad, to own the tracks that you're operating on. Unfortunately, the Boston and Maine was dragging its feet on building up a sale agreement for the Cheshire Branch. They agreed at first to sell the line from Keene to North Walpole to the state of New Hampshire, but by fall 1962, they still had not written up a sale agreement. Adding to the fire, in November 1962, we had a state election, and Governor Wesley Powell left office, as did a lot of supporters of the Steamtown project. The incoming administration with Governor John King at first agreed to support the Steamtown project the way that the previous administration had. But by January 1963, there was still no sale agreement for the Cheshire branch. And the idea starts to get a lot of flack from people around the state, including this gentleman, William Lowe, who, by most accounts, was a horrible, venomous, racist, and sexist person. And he wrote a number of newspaper articles trashing Nelson Blount, trashing the state of New Hampshire, trashing people that had an interest in trains, and writing all kinds of insidious articles trying to gain public disapproval for the Steamtown project. And he wasn't the only one. There were a number of other people that started to fire at the Steamtown plan. All of this was beginning to weigh on Nelson's mind. He had this collection of 40 steam locomotives that he had purchased with his own money and was willing to give to the state of New Hampshire to establish this park to educate the future generations that had missed out on the steam era. He was quoted as saying, "Knowing what I know now, I wouldn't make the offer. I would just like to be the engineer." In a final show of goodwill in early 1963, he offered not only his personal collection, but the tourist railroad, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern itself, to the state of New Hampshire to support the Steamtown project. But unfortunately, on February 16, 1962, the governor's advisory board voted 5-1 to kill the Steamtown-Keene plan. The single season of excursions, running 4 months, had drawn 14,000 paying customers to the city of Keene, without any museum ever having been broken ground. Mayor Robert Mallet, he never ran for governor, who passed away in 2015, was quoted as being said, "This was one of the state's worst mistakes, losing the Steamtown project." He also went on to serve in the House of Representatives and president of Keene State College as well. Another great quote from Robert Adams, who was Nelson's vice president and also went on to serve as the president of the Green Mountain Railroad. He had said it looked like a great opportunity for the region. And at first, everybody was behind it 100%. But history just didn't work out that way. And because of it, there's a lot of things that may have played out differently. And one of those things was Steamtown's future. After losing in Keene, Nelson retreated to his North Walpole facility that he still owned. And in 1963, he opens the Steamtown Museum for the very first time in North Walpole, with Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern excursions running in the opposite direction towards Keene. 1963 season brought another 11,000 visitors, 25,000 total, with the opening of the museum in North Walpole. The city of Keene, even though it was no longer host to the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern, did see steam trains for one last time, one weekend in 1963. Nelson brought his train back to downtown Keene for a weekend of excursions. But after that, he never returned to Keene, and steam trains never ran in the city of Keene again. This is a shot at Main Street in the summer of 1963 of the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern. In 1964, Nelson decides that the facility at North Walpole is still too small for the museum, and so he buys a tract of land across the river in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and starts to build a museum in Bellows Falls, Steamtown, USA. He works with Governor Philip Hoff, the first Democratic governor of Vermont, and Phil Hoff champions the Steamtown project, helps Nelson take over the former Rutland Railroad line from Bellows Falls to Rutland. And so they established Steamtown excursions on that line in Vermont, and also the Green Mountain Railroad to handle freight service on the old Rutland line. And so by 1964, Nelson has moved to Vermont. This is a shot of the Steamtown facility undergoing construction at Riverside. in Bellows Falls. One of the unintended consequences of Steamtown losing in Keene, I firmly believe, was the eventual death of Nelson Blount himself. Keene is very close to Dublin, where Nelson lived. In fact, it's probably only 15 minutes away. Bellows Falls, Vermont, is closer to 35 minutes away. And so when Steamtown opened in Bellows Falls, Nelson built a small little landing strip for his airplanes so he could fly his planes from his farm in Dublin to Bellows Falls, Vermont. He would just drive home when Steamtown was in Keene, or when the Monadnock Steamtown in Northern was in Keene. August 31st, 1967, this photograph was taken of Nelson running the very last steam excursion of the day out of Riverside, Steamtown Riverside in Bellows Falls. When this train got back at the end of the day, he climbed into his private plane, flew back home. Somewhere near Keene, the engine gave out on his airplane. He tried to find a place to land. He settled on a farm field that looked long enough to support a landing. But as his airplane was coming down to land, turned out that the land was a little bit too elevated, and his landing gear hit the ground and the plane bounced back up into the air, flew head on into a tree, and he was killed at age 49. If Steamtown had opened in Keene in 1962, would he have even flown home? He may have lived. It's worth thinking about. And he's buried not far from Keene, as a matter of fact. Nelson's buried in the town of Dublin, the Dublin Cemetery, in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. And his tombstone is inscribed with number 89, which is that steam engine that he operated on the last day of his life. So the Steamtown legacy in Keene was a story of something that almost happened and for a number of reasons didn't happen. So what happened to the railroad in Keene? Well, the Boston and Maine Railroad continued providing freight service to Keene on their Cheshire branch until 1972, when it was abandoned. After that, the only access into Keene was the Ashwillett branch of the Boston and Maine, which ran from Keene to Brattleboro. And the Boston and Maine operated that line until the late 1970s. And then in an ironic twist of fate, the Green Mountain Railroad, which Nelson had created back in 1955, took over freight service on that branch for a few more years until 1984, when they gave up and the railroad was lifted. And to this day, there's not a single railroad line that serves the city of Keene, New Hampshire. And so there's another unintended consequence. If Steamtown had opened in Keene in 1962 with state funding as a state park, it might still be open today. And there may still be railroads in Keene. But as a result of things turning out the way they did, it wasn't to be. And a nice final shot during the summer of 1962. This is in the diner lounge car, the Mountaineer, of Nelson and number 15. The 1962 season, and basically every chapter of the Steamtown story, is so evocative of its time period. It really is such a 1960s story when you think about colors and the clothing and the vehicles and all of the things that happened. It's such a time capsule. And when we look at these old photographs, I mean, that was 63 years ago that this happened now. And it seems like such a long time ago that it can be difficult to place ourselves into that time period. But a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to purchase Alan Thomas's Monadnock, Steamtown and Northern 8mm film that he shot in the summer of 1962. And so I was able to convert that film to digital and add a couple other pieces to kind of give it a time capsule feel. And so we have a little film to show you. Say it's 63rd anniversary and not 68. And so that's 1962, what was and what possibly could have been if things had played out a little bit differently. By the way, that sound that you heard is actually number 15. That is dubbed from a 45 record that was taken, I believe, when Steamtown was in Vermont. If you're interested in learning more, some of you may have read, but there is a book that goes along with this story and tells the entire story of the early years of Steamtown from 1960 to about 1968. Steam Trains of Yesteryear, if you're interested, there are still copies available at the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society, bmrrhs.org. The story gets even crazier, if you can believe it. And I've also created a website, the Steamtown Historical Collective, which is sort of a permanent exhibit dedicated to preserving that history of Nelson Blount, the Monadnock, Steamtown, and Northern, and the New England years of Steamtown, USA, which of course still exists today as a National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania. At that website, you'll find biographies of the people in the story, news about anything that's happened to Steamtown in the last few years, a collection of the newspaper articles and sources that I used. You can read through all of the contemporary accounts of what was happening back then. There's some photographs. You can listen to those records, those 45 records. So if you're interested, that is steamtown.org. I was able to snag that domain name, so steamtown.org. And that's it. Thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
You have a very good presentation, Rick, sir, but it would have been nice if Steamtown did stay in Keene because it would be a not too far of a distance for me.
I went to college in Keene. I would have liked it a lot. I can tell you that much.
My
Yep.
cousin went to college in Keene.
Yep.
One,
Thank you.
one of those first pictures, Rick. You said it was Bridgeton and Harrison. Where was that?
Yeah, would have
What
been
was
Bruce and Harrison at that
What-
point in time. Yep.
Where? What lake was that? On that
Don't-
picture?
Don't know the name of it, but it's the one they ran right alongside there.
Isn't that
Okay.
Hancock Pond?
That's it. Yep, Hancock Pond.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else? Very good program, Rick, as usual.
Thank you very much.
Rick, I'd like to say thank you very much for the presentation tonight. I've read your book. It's a great book, well worth picking up and reading. You've done some great articles in the Railroad and Railfan magazine on Steamtown. I thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Happy to do it. Well, if nobody has any other questions, thank you again for having me. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And if anybody has any questions, reach out to me on email. I'll talk to you all later.
That
Bye-bye.
sounds great. Thanks, Rick.